Alright, so apparently this is going to be my 69th video. Because of that, I thought I'd do something nice. So today I'm just gonna go over like a bit more advanced shading. I mean, it's not really advanced, but like intermediate, I guess. Basically, I'm going to be going over brush shading for high res. Couple of things before we start. I always have my settings originally set to 1 brush width, 0 hardness, anti-aliasing disabled, and selection quality not anti-alias, as well as selections. I always have this to add just so it makes it easier. I'm just going to create myself a new 512 by 512 canvas. Delete this one, and I'm just going to go through the normal process that I would normally do. So first, on a new layer, I make a straight line going from the bottom to the top corner and turn down the opacity. This is just going to be the guideline, so I know that the sword will be symmetrical. Then I go to the next layer and I start with a sort of sketch. Take my brush tool, put the brush width really high up, like 60 or so. Make sure anti-aliasing is still disabled. I'm just going to make a very rudimentary sketch of kind of the proportions that I want this sword to have. So something like that maybe. I know it looks stupid right now. Something like that's going to be the main idea of the shape of the blade. Now we'll get to refining this shape. The thing about brush shading is that it's really good for making curved shapes. If you want to make something that looks like it's curved and make it look like a convincing real life object, then brush shading is probably your best bet. So maybe I'll start off with something like this and then continue on from there. So here's the shape of the pommel that I just made. I'm going to fill it in with black. Now I'm going to go on to the handle using a different color so I can distinguish them, and then connect it and then fill it with gray. Now I'm going to start on the cross guard, so I take another color and start making my shape. Whenever you're making these like sort of semi-advanced high-res shapes, you always want to have an idea in mind prior to actually starting. For example, I thought I'd try and make sort of a wings shape, and usually the shape actually takes me the longest portion of time when I'm doing anything with high res, because I want to make sure that the shape is the best it can be before I actually get onto shading it. Technically, it is possible to use like really nice shading and make any shape look good. At the same time, having a good shape really just kind of brings your entire item together. All right, so now you can see that I've finished the shape of the entire hilt, that is to say everything except the blade. And you can see that I've colored each individual part of the hilt as a different color. That way, whenever I want to make a selection so I can shade a part individually, I can just select that part and I can easily shade it without having to worry about fixing the selections and whatnot. It just makes everything easier if you have every part as a different color. And as you can see, I have lots of vestigial parts here. You can see this part, I could have just had it the same shape as the gray, but having this extra shape here allows for more creativity, more complexity. So that's generally a good thing that you want to have. Now, as for the actual shape of the blade, there's not really too much you can do in terms of being creative, because unless you want to do a curved blade, there's not many styles that really look good. But I'm just going to do a very simple blade, probably something like this, and there we go. This is going to be the shape that I'm going to start shading now. Before you start shading, you want to check over and look one more time to make sure that the proportions are how you want them to be, because after you've already shaded the item, it's really difficult to go back and actually change the shape or the proportions of the texture without having to reshade it over again. So you really want to make sure that you're satisfied with the shape as it is right now. Once you're done with that, it's time to duplicate this layer and make everything to the colors that you want them to be. I'm thinking I want this little gray part right here to be like kind of a white kind of thing. And then this part over here to be gray. These bits down here I might have as gold, and we'll worry about the blade later. But I think this will probably have to be a bit lighter blue. So once you've done that, it's time to actually start shading. Now for beginners, I would definitely suggest doing outlines. It makes it a lot harder to screw up, because sometimes if you do a texture without outlines, it's really easy to make it look unrealistic or just plain bad. So I'm gonna add this outline here and then keep it like that for now and make an inline. And now here's something you should always do. Whenever you're doing a brush shaded texture, you should always do an inline if you're doing an outline. So you can see here, I have both an outline and an inline. If I didn't want to do any outlines at all, then I could do that as well. But since I'm going to do an outline, I'm also doing an inline. And this just makes it look better. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to label all of these layers just so I don't get confused. This is the back color. This is the light gray outline, and this is the light gray inline. I'm going to modify the opacity of these outlines and inlines just so that it looks a bit better with the contrast, and I'm going to start shading with the brush now. So I'm going to go to a new layer, turn the blend mode to overlay, and then I'm going to use white. So I'm going to change to white, and then turn my brush width up to something pretty high, like probably around 40 for this. Actually 35 might be better. And then turn anti-aliasing on, and then basically just do a highlight. It's pretty self-explanatory. Common misconception that people have about brush shading, it's not really difficult to do the brush shading itself. It's more difficult getting the concept of what you want to make. When you're shading with the brush, you want to make sure you keep in mind exactly how the light is going to hit the object as if it were a real life object. I'm making sure to define all of these spaces where the light kind of reflects off of here and where it doesn't. And additionally, when you're using the brush tool, you always want to make sure that you're using the eraser as well. So I think that's pretty good in terms of the highlight. I'm going to turn down the opacity of this layer so that it doesn't get too bright. We actually increase the contrast on these outlines and stuff. Now I'm going to label this layer as light gray brush highlight. I like to be very descriptive with my layer names. Whenever I'm looking back at a paint.net file later, I know for sure what I'm looking at. So now I'm going to a new layer, setting this one to overlay. This is going to be the light gray brush shadow. Once again, I'm going to start with the same process, except this time I'm going to be using black instead of white. And as you can see already, there's a very clear problem with this, and that's because I'm using overlay. You see, these outlines get so dark because overlay makes the darker things even darker than before, and keeps things that are almost white still almost white. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to turn this opacity down a bit, and I'm going to duplicate this layer, and then here's the trick. You set this to multiply. Using overlay and multiply in conjunction allows you to get depth that looks more realistic, because using multiply actually darkens the entire shape rather than just the outlines. So now that you've done this, you might at some point want to edit the shading a bit, and it's very simple to do. You just do whatever you need to do, but on the shadow, make sure that whatever changes you make also go onto this second shadow layer. I'm going to actually label here that this one is overlay and this one is multiply. Once you think you're satisfied with one shape, you basically rinse and repeat for the other ones. Another trick that you should always use is when you have something like this, where you have a shape that's overlapping onto another shape, you should add a drop shadow using the brush tool on your shadow layers, and this way it just kind of shows to the viewer that this is indeed a 3D object with several different parts of different depth. Here you can see that I added like a nice little indent right here, and all I did was I made like a little crescent moon shape on the highlight and then an opposite crescent moon shape on the shadow layer. Very simple but nice technique to add a bit more depth to the object. And notice that this entire time, I have one set of layers for this part of the crossguard because it's a different color than these parts of the hilt. It's a lighter gray, and therefore I have a completely different set of layers for it. Once again, I'm going to have a completely different set of layers for this gold part right here, as well as this gem and the blade. So whenever you're working with a different color, you always want to have a different set of layers so you can easily customize them individually. Also, another tip is that if you don't think your highlight is too bright and it's already at max opacity, what you can do is just duplicate that layer and then turn down the opacity of that layer. That way you basically get another opacity slider that you can adjust and then increase further. So far, I've only been shading grayscale colors like this white and this gray right here, but shading is a little different when you're working with actual colors. For instance, let me try adding a simple outline to these two parts. Sure, looks good, like this. Here we go. And now if I turn down the opacity of this, you see you get this disgusting greenish gold color, and you never want to have this when you're making a high-res brush object, because when you shade it, it'll look even worse. It'll turn even more green than it was already. So what you can do to prevent this is turn this really far down, and then duplicate this layer, set it to overlay, turn this up a bit. Now you can see we can get a bit more of the hue shift that you might be used to, and that way you can add a lot more boldness and color to your objects. So whenever you want to shade a colored object, for anything you do, you'll always want to have a layer set to multiply, which darkens the color, as well as a layer set to overlay, which hue shifts that color. So I'm going to set this to gold overlay outline, and this one is going to be gold multiply outline. And I'm going to do the same thing with the inline as well as the shadows. So you can see I've got this. I'm going to turn this to overlay, turn down the opacity a bit, get the right amount of hue shift, and duplicate it, set this one to multiply, then decrease the opacity a bit more. And remember, you can always mess around with any of the layer opacities just to get the proper amount of contrast that you want. Now we're going to start shading these using brush. So I'm going to start off by using the highlight. I'm going to turn this to overlay, set this gold brush highlight. And the good thing about highlights is that you don't have to do the trick with multiply and overlay. You can only use overlay and it should look fine. So I'm going to select both of these and start with shading as I normally would. Once again, keep in mind how this would look in real life if it were a real life object. So I'm making sure to stay consistent with all of the 3D nature of this object. Try to make it look as realistic as possible. Imagine that you have a singular light source somewhere around this area, sometimes over here, but not that often. But imagine you have a singular light source that is projecting light across all of these different surfaces. Try to imagine how that light would reflect off of those surfaces into your camera or your eyes or whatever. Keep in mind that you can always change the brush size to get different like softnesses, I guess is the proper term. Like you can see here I have a very large brush size, so it has lots of blur right here. But if I turn that down to like 11, you can see it's much less blurred. Making proper use of different brush widths can really help you out. Now I think I'm finished with the highlights, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to decrease the opacity. Now going on to the brush shadow, I'm going to turn this to overlay, gold brush shadow. But you can see that as soon as I start shading, it turns really incredibly reddish. And this is a very bad thing that I often see a lot in like beginners high-res textures. You get really red shades of gold when you're trying to shade with only overlay. So to fix this, what we do is that we turn this opacity down quite a bit, and then we duplicate this and set this to multiply once again. Turn this down even further. Right, multiply it right here. And now you can see the effect is much less severe. Be very careful when you're using overlay, especially on colors like gold, which can turn red or green really easily. So now I think I'm done shading with the gold, and you can see that I've started to create a lot of layers. But the advantage of this is that I can go to any of these layers, mess around with the opacity, the blending mode, anything I want, and it's very easy to do that if you have this many layers. So with this blade, I think I'm gonna try and do something special. So I'm gonna first start off by making this outline. I did add this little thing in the middle, that'll be for later. The problem with using brush on blades is that it doesn't really work unless you're doing a curved blade, because the idea behind brush is that you're making a curved object. And you generally don't want your blade to be curved because then it'll be like a dull blade. And that's not a good idea unless that's the style you're going for, in which case I guess it's fine. But even still, it's generally not something you should go for unless you really know what you're doing. So at this point, I would just recommend that you go ahead and shade the blade with gradient, just as you normally would. In the end, you should get something that looks pretty cool, even if you didn't use the brush tool. And trust me, if you tried to use the brush tool with the blade, you most likely would not get something that looks good. Just sticking to what you're kind of used to is often the best choice when it comes to blades. But yeah, this was just like a really basic high-res tutorial about brush. I understand that this really isn't that great of a texture. If I had spent more time on it, it would look 100% better. But the idea behind it is just that, like, the more time you spend on a texture, the more effort you put into it, the more you'll get in return. So for instance, you can see that these textures, I spent a lot more time on these textures, and proportionately, they turned out a lot nicer than what I just made. But at the same time, I did also use a couple more advanced techniques with these. Also, these are the textures that I've made so far for my survival pack that I'll probably not be releasing anytime soon because these took a really long time to make, but whenever I do release it, it'll be pretty nice in my opinion. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully this tutorial helped a bit. I'll keep the paint.net file for this sword in the description so that y'all can see like kind of the way that I did mine. But yeah, that's about it. I'll see you guys later.